Welcome to Cheaper Than Therapy, a podcast that journeys into conversations that demystify, destigmatize, and desensitize what goes on both inside the therapy room and in daily life.
I'm Vanessa Bennett.
And I'm Danae Logan.
And we are seekers, soul sisters, and holders of sacred space. Every week, we sit down for soul-provoking conversations with fellow seekers, thought leaders, change makers, and even real people during live coaching sessions as they navigate the hard work it takes to be a human.
This is Cheaper Than Therapy.
Coming at you live from New York City. Turning up my volume. Guys, don't
at us about the sound.
no reviews about our audio, okay?
We're aware.
We're on my phone. We're
we
in
have
New York.
no microphones.
We don't have a mic today, but we love you and we wanted to bring you an episode. And so here we are.
Unless you don't want to hear from us for a minute, it's gonna be what does John call it? What style? I don't know.
John calls it something. Yeah. If y'all don't listen to my partner's podcast, you don't even know. He like slurps his coffee in your ear.
oh, we know about that part.
Like ours is top notch compared to that.
You don't know how good y'all have it. We could be slurping in your ear.
That's the truth.
Aw.
But we're happy you're here listening. It's Cheaper Than Therapy.
Yeah. I feel like we talking about transitions because I feel like everybody's been talking about being in a liminal space or a transitional moment. Mm. And for those of you who don't know what we mean when we say a liminal space, I feel like that's a depth term, right? And it's the space between where I'm not the person that I was, and yet I am not yet who I know I am becoming. So it can be a really destabilizing space to be in.
Yeah. So part of kind of the move towards, I don't want to say this, like, I guess it's the path of individuation, but there's something about understanding and really accepting the reality of the patterns, the universal patterns of life, death, life, right? Or kind of death, darkness, rebirth, right? And that's what the liminal space is. It's the process of darkness. It's the process of death, right? It's the part that we're uncomfortable. It's before we've emerged. Like you said, we don't know who we will be. And so that's usually where the discomfort is. You know, that's where the air quote suffering is. But obviously you can't have birth without death. You can't have light without dark. You can't have joy without sadness. So, you know, so many of us are terrified of this experience or terrified of the discomfort, but we forget that it's required, right?
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was just so struck by the extent to which I feel like we are in one. So many of us individually, but collectively as well. And I think to me, there's a lot of that is us in the unknown birthing space of our collective feminine, which is there's a way that we've done life. There's been sort of a prescriptive ideology around what constitutes a good life, what is a, quote, normal way of living. And a lot of that is being challenged. And I would say some of those paradigms are dying off in a way that is necessary and so unbelievably beautiful to be alive to witness. Yeah. And
scary as fuck.
There's no, it's really like uncharted territory in so many ways. And that is the feminine, you know, like that is the darkness. That is the unknown womb space of who we are becoming, what we are birthing. And we've just, for so long, told ourselves the story that is not, that we can avoid that, right? That we can avoid the darkness, that we can just follow a prescription for life and we'll be safe. And I think we are really living through a time where the universe is saying we don't get to live in that illusion anymore.
Yeah. And we've followed like a script that says, here's what you do, here's what you don't do, here's what like a good life looks like, here's what you should and shouldn't do. And so one could argue like, oh, there's containment in that or there's structure in that, but it's not it's not healthy structure. The structure is not coming from within,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's an external source telling us what we should and shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I've been watching, a lot of clients, especially going through right now, and I think even collectively to what you're speaking to, is that we're all finally, I mean, maybe all is a big word, but a lot of people are finally kind of coming around to realizing how much of our like knowing or like direction in our life we've been putting in the hands of an other, an outside source, and realizing how lacking we are in actually having an internal sense of, direction, containment, whatever word you want to use. And I think a lot of the work maybe that we've been doing collectively has been on just that, has been about finding what that internal knowing actually is. And maybe that's a little bit of the liminal space, is like the discomfort of actually finding what that is before you can act on it. Because the acting on it almost doesn't feel like liminal space. It feels like the finding it is the liminal space. The acting on it, to me, I don't know, like symbolically kind of represents to me the actual emerging.
Yeah. And so again, like if we think about the sitting in it as like the feminine, the being with the darkness, the being with the discomfort and not running away from it. That's a lot of what we're learning to do, is to be still in the space of not knowing and not try to like action our way out of it, not try to find the next thing that we're doing, the next answer, the productivity that will keep us from having to feel the feelings that come to the surface. And then to your point, I think once we not get comfortable in the darkness, because I don't think it's about comfort so much as it's like radical acceptance of what this is.
Yeah.
Then we move from the space of inspired action, but it's like I don't move until I'm clear.
Yeah.
And that is so hard in the midst of the darkness, I find, to believe I will ever feel clear. I feel like we're speaking about this sort of
like symbolically.
Yeah. And that I know for me, that's hard for me to like wrap my head around when people,
hear it,
speak about things in sort of an esoteric way. So I feel like I kind of want to give like tangible examples of what we mean or how this is showing up for people,
Yeah. I mean, I think collectively we can all understand that like, there's a lot of crazy shit going on right now in the globe. I mean, there has been for a while, right? Like I think 2020, listen, there's always been crazy shit going on in the globe, right? Like there's never been a time where it's just been like, rainbows and butterflies. But since 2020, it feels like there's been an extra amount of cray-cray happening out there. And I think that we've been being squeezed. Like I get this image of us being squeezed. And so I think when we talk about like being in the darkness, I think that's it. Like it's this, to your point, you're never going to feel comfortable in that discomfort, but there's an acceptance of, and like almost like the veil is lifted, where I think people are starting to see things for what they are. People are starting to, again, this is that inner authority versus just like accepting and, whatever anybody else tells me I need to do or should be or should listen to. That feels like that's kind of dying away. And so this idea of inspired action to me feels just like what you're seeing happening across the world, right? People are standing up, people are speaking up. And it actually doesn't even really matter, in my opinion, what you're actually speaking up about or for. I think it's just the point that people are pushing back against the shoulds, or people are pushing back against like, I should believe this, or I shouldn't say that, or, we can't have these kind of conversations, or we shouldn't. And that I feel like is what I'm seeing a lot of people push back on, is like, no, we have to be able to have hard conversations. I don't know. Am I making sense, or am I talking in circles?
No, you're totally making sense.
It's 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah. I think to me, what I hear in what you're saying and what feels true is there's something about we're not allowed to hide in the fear anymore and tell ourselves the story that we can escape discomfort and keep ourselves safe. It's like all of these things have been there.
Yeah.
But there's been a comfortable level of denial, of distraction, of
privilege
that we don't have to see certain things. And I think life is really challenging us to say, what would you be doing with your life if you weren't afraid? How would you be interacting with the collective if you had no choice but to get really clear about who you want to be? I think that there's so many ways that we are at, what Eckhart Tolle speaks of as like an evolve or die time. And it sounds dramatic as I say that, but literally, like, we've never been more like polarized and unable to be in community and connection with people who think differently than we do, who like, we're like so hungry to identify where safety is so that we can sort of like go back into our vacuum of safety. And it's like, no, you can't go there anymore. And so it becomes, even if you look at like AI and all of the ways that like we as humans are really being challenged with, like, is there going to be space for us if we don't come correct with what our values are and how we want to live? And I think it's a reckoning, and I don't think any of it is an accident, but it's really asking us to, like, with a black light, look at the way we've been living for a very long time and ask ourselves some challenging questions.
Yeah, I think this also is even showing up, obviously the work that you and I do, whether that's working with individuals or couples, I see this even showing up, we were talking collective, but I mean all the way down into like the individual level. I mean, obviously the collective and the individual are connected. But I see it showing up in like the women I work with and like what they have been, I don't want to say putting up with, maybe putting up with actually, but just what we're willing to take, what we're willing to listen to, what we're not willing to listen to. I mean, I think even in that conversation, like that's changed, we're seeing it. I'm seeing it even in women who aren't dating and who are like doing the inner work of, what is my life? What do I want to do with this life if I have no shoulds? If I have no bullshit, like outside structures being placed on me, what would I do? And they're doing it. Like they're actually moving into a space of action. And it's beautiful to see. And I guess that's why I say like collective and individual, obviously being connected, because I feel like I'm witnessing it happening kind of in all levels,
Yeah, I was just thinking, and I mean, Vanessa's got a birthday coming up, y'all. So I think there's a way that we've been talking about how that is also an aspect of what happens to women as we age. And, I'm 45, and I feel like we were just talking as you're like coming towards your 40s a little bit, that there's something in some of that like shoulds drop away. I think for women as we get older. Now society in so many ways tells us the story that we become less relevant. And I think that is certainly a narrative to like get on board with or buy into, or not. But I think that there's like a acceptance of myself in my skin, a wisdom that I've accumulated along the path that women feel. And there's just, hopefully, and I mean, not necessarily, I guess, but there's a way that like some of that is what I hear in what you're speaking to. And there's a collective individuation, I believe, is happening younger for everybody. Like it's like everybody is starting to do some of the work that collectively we would normally do as we age a little bit, or as we get a little bit further along in the aging process. It's happening younger. Like we're just starting to say, if I am not going to be the person that my parents or my community expects me to be, so I fit in, then what does that look like for me to live a life that is designed by me and that is true?
Do you think a little bit of that is because we have access to information now that we didn't used to have access to? Like I was thinking while you were talking about how, when you go back even to like the beginning of like, let's just use Christianity, like when it was being kind of spread, right? Like how it used to only be, it was written, the Bible was written in and sermons were given in Latin, right? And it was done that way purposely because the common person couldn't read in Latin. And so it was used as a way to kind of control, right, the access that people had. to the information. And when you think about, like, let's think about that time, right? So let's say, like, let's just say medieval times. I'm not being historically maybe accurate right now. People did not have access to information, right? Whether they literally couldn't read or it was kept from them purposely. Whereas now with technology, there's no keeping information from people anymore, right? Like, this used to be the information of a very privileged few people that kept spiritual truths or like this is how I commune. And I just feel like now people actually have access to information or have words for things or experiences that they might not have had words to before. And it feels more like democratized in a way, which I'm happy about. I mean, I think that's amazing. And I think you actually are seeing that in like our collective evolution. I think people just finally have fucking access. Like, it's democratized. It's not being held out of reach from people. Like, people are being able to, even when I think, again, I'm like, I'm not trying to just talk about Christianity here, but obviously being from the West, it's like, you know, the religion I'm the most familiar with. It's like Christianity has kind of always taught us, I have to go through somebody in order to get access to God. Like, there's actually a human person, a man, right, that I have to go through as like a gateway. And we all know that that's not actually true, right? Like, we know that we actually all have access to that ourselves, and we can access that connection anytime. But I feel like more people know that now. And I don't know, there's something about information and just like social media that just came up when you were talking about that. And I thought how beautiful that is, that people have been given access to things that they would never have been given access to.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because I think of it often that we are experiencing a collective awakening. And when I say awakening, what I really mean is remembrance. I think not only do we have access to source, to the divine, but we are more and more coming into a collective awareness that that is not separate from me.
Right.
And that so much of the, you know, maybe what's being democratized is space and time to do some of that work that brings me into that space of remembrance. Because I think there's like, what is information, I guess, is what's coming up for me. Like, there's been information, but it's like, you know, Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And there's so many times, like, there's this multi-generational trauma or pain or ways of being that aren't examined. And I just think we're living through a generation where so many people are saying this pattern stops with me. And so whatever the pain point, the alcoholism, the way of being that has been in my family for generations, I'm going to get curious about why that's been the case. I am going to be willing to stay in the dark night of the soul without distracting from it, without running from it. And I think that is where we find the God within. And I just think for so long, it's been too scary to stay there. And so we've used all of these other things, sometimes like information, frankly, to distract ourselves from the God within. And it's like, if I can, to the point you were making before, just believe that some external authority can give me the answers, can give me the safety in, quote, God, and knowing this is like what happens to me when I leave this body. These are the answers that, you know, it's always been this quest to know what we're doing here and what happens when we leave. But I think when we say, I don't need to know because there's only so much I can know, but I believe that I am safe because that source is never separate from me. I just think we're more and more like, and to me, that is the return of the feminine. We're getting more comfortable in the space of our darkness because we don't feel as alone there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting you said that, because I was thinking when you say like, we don't feel alone there, you know, I'm sure you get the same kind of comments, because I get these comments too, like on my social media or whatever, where people will be like, oh, you know, in so many words, like, oh, what you're pushing for is like hyper individualism, or like you're pushing for people to like be alone, and what we need is more community. And, you know, when I'm talking about like codependency or whatever. And it's always interesting to me, right? Because I'm like, I don't actually see that what I'm saying is that at all. I think what I'm saying, and I know what you say often as well, is like being able to be with yourself is the way to be able to then be in healthy communion with other people. And if we're not able to be with ourselves, we're not able to also be healthy with others. And I think so many people take what we're saying as like, I don't know, this push to like, you know, I guess I just say hyper individualism again, for lack of a better term. But I just was thinking about that when you were talking, because I was like, I think a lot of what you and I talk about is this idea of returning to self and returning to home and finding the God within, and all these things that you and I are kind of throwing out there. And like, yeah, the purpose of this life in so many ways is to like love and be loved and all of these things. But we haven't been doing it right. You know, for centuries, we haven't been doing it right. We got to change. We got to change it up.
Well, it's the namaste quality, which is the divine within me sees the divine within you. But until I see the God within me,
yep,
it's hard for me to hold the God within you without judgment, without expectation, without limitation based on what my ego mind perceives about you. But I don't know, like the more compassionate and loving and accepting I am of myself, oh, does that make me so much more able to hold everyone around me with those same qualities. But I think what I hear and what you're saying is, you know, a lot of times the expectations we have of other people and the ways that we feel shortchanged or betrayed, or they're always about our relationship with ourselves, period. Like if we dig a little deeper, if we look at like, you know, the ways that someone has hurt me or betrayed me, it's always based on something I believe that is lacking within me, or they wouldn't treat me this way. There's always some way that I'm telling myself a story about what that means about me. That's an arguable story. But the more that I just see myself as like completely like this perfect emanation of God here to learn and to like, I don't need to be perfect, then I see what other people do as having absolutely nothing to do with me and just being like their path of understanding, and it's not personal. But in order to do that, I really have to be able to do that for myself first.
So what you're saying is like being able to accept the imperfectness. Ooh, it's thundering and lightning outside, guys. Oh, I miss New York. I miss the thunderstorms in New York. Seeing the imperfectness and being able to be okay or accept the imperfectness in myself is the only way that I will be able to see and accept the imperfectness in somebody else.
It's that thing, you know, we always talk about, we can only meet another person to the extent that we've met ourselves. And so if I believe that I need to be perfect to be worthy of love, if I believe that in my shortcomings, I'm unworthy, of course, those things become intolerable, in another person. But the more that I see myself and say, I'm just here learning. Every experience I go through is meant to teach me about myself. I'm not meant to do this life school perfectly. What would be the point?
Yeah.
Then, of course, I see that in other people and I say they're learning, they're growing, they're figuring it out. It's not for them to do perfectly. They don't owe me that. Like, I don't have the right to their soul's journey. Like, that's what they're here working out. It's perfect. But I think more and more we're starting to like have this soul consciousness that maybe we didn't have, or, you know, we forgot for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is going back to what I was saying about people kind of, you know, making their comments, I guess, and stuff on our videos and the things that we say. I think it's what you just said. It's like so much of our work, or so much, I guess, of like what I tell people when they're doing this work around codependency is it's not about not being in relationship to other people, but it's about, you know, it's about, how do I say this? It's about, I don't know, being able to be with yourself without making anybody else be anything else. Does that make sense? So it's like, and that is what we've been doing, right? Because we've been brought up to believe that there is some external source that knows the truth, and that there are shoulds, and there are things that I should and shouldn't do to be loved, and I have to act certain ways to be loved. We then also put that on other people because we put it on ourselves. And so I think so much of the codependency recovery work that I talk about, at least, is like, it's the journey of getting past that needing to, it's the journey of trying to get past that with myself so that I also then don't put that on somebody else. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think that there's just a way that the only person that we get to be in control of is ourselves. Yeah. And I think, like, it's so funny. I was just talking to someone about like how much we're just like not doing things that don't make sense anymore, if that makes sense. Like, it's like all these ways that I feel like, and I don't know if you experience this in your conversations with clients and stuff, but there's this thing of like being in these repetitive patterns is starting to get like old. Like, I keep beating my head against the wall with the same conversation, with the same fight with my partner, with the same whatever I'm doing that is not working. And I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm tired. And it's just like, I feel like collectively we're wanting more ease and flow and like a life that we enjoy. Like, maybe some of what we have experienced, especially in the last 4 years, has just like really clarified like what matters. Like, I just feel like there's a lot of this BS that we concern ourselves with at the end of the day
is BS.
And ultimately, the keeping up with the Joneses, the what other people think of me, and what's impressive, all of these things. It's just like, what it is? Like, it just came to me as I was speaking. The wounded masculine paradigm cares about how things look from the outside. The feminine, the healthy feminine paradigm cares about how things actually feel for me on the inside. And I think that is another part of, we're no longer willing to just focus on the highlight reels that are impressive to other people when they just really feel awful in the felt experience of my life.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I don't know why I just had this thought about like social media for me. Like, it's always been such a struggle for me. I mean, I've talked about it on the podcast before, but like, I still love-hate relationship with it. But like, it really does like truly feel awful in my system. Like, I've never liked it. Well, I shouldn't say that. When like Instagram was new and it was really just like beautiful photos and it was more of like a creative expression, I really enjoyed it. And the second it started to turn away from that, I know that that's when I stopped enjoying it. But I've always just struggled with how much I don't like being on my phone, period. I don't like how it feels like it has so much control over your life and like you're on it for everything. And it, like, I mean, I needed to go anywhere because I have no fucking sense of direction. I needed to call people. I needed to be on social media. I need to email. Like, I just feel like we're on it all the time, And it's just like so the opposite of how I've always wanted to and tried to live my life. Mindfully, present, embodied, and it's none of those things. And so I think that's part of maybe recently, I've really been only on it very, very briefly in the last couple of months. I mean, obviously I'm writing a book too, so I'm just fucking busy, but I think it's a little bit of that. Like, it's a little bit of being like, I just don't like the way this feels in my body. And I've got to figure out a way to have a different relationship to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I went through a period where I wasn't posting, or maybe that was, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something, where I just like had really pulled back from social media. And I think I shared with you, Brandon Collinsworth, shout out to him. I love his content, but he was like, my relationship with social media changed when I stopped thinking of it as social media and started thinking of it as service media. And now when something is useful to me, when something feels like it could be supportive of someone else, I post as like here's my forever for whoever this could be of service to.
Yeah.
Like, amazing. Like, this is something I can do. This is a way that I can, you know, as a therapist, be supportive of the collective for maybe people who don't have access to some of the conversations that we have in the rooms, or I guess on this podcast, all the time. But it stopped feeling like something that I was like attempting to like curate or do right, or like, and it's just like, now I feel like when I have something that, you know, I just feel moved by, I thank you for that share, Brandon, because I feel like it really shifted my relationship with the medium.
I feel like I have things that I'm moved by and that I want to share with people all of the time, like multiple times throughout the day. It's from that point to the actual physical picking up the phone and being on the phone to even type it into the phone that I have the physical reaction to. Like it's the actual having the phone in my hand. I literally don't want the phone in my hand. So like, if I could have that moment of like, this feels really helpful for somebody, I could tell somebody else and they could do it. I would love that. But it's the actual time that it takes to get on it and create it and put it out there. I know that it will be of service, but that's the part that I have so much problem with. Like, there's something in my body that has a visceral response to being on my phone like that just, I don't know, I struggle with it.
You know, I think like Gary Vee, I'm like quoting
Gary
all these people who have really inspired me with things that they've said. But I think so much of like, we have to like figure out what is our form of service and what is like, this is the way I move through the world because this is who I was destined to be. And it's not supposed to be the same for everybody. Like,
and I feel like I fight it. Like, I feel like whatever mine is not, and it feels like a fight to me all the time.
And I feel like sometimes with you, babe, like I do see you like fighting against your nature. And I'm like, your nature is beautiful. It is what it is for a reason.
Yeah.
And like the way that you produce, the way that you delegate, the way that you see like structure, there's certainly like your interior design, but like there are all these things that I watch like just like flow for you. They're easy. Like, it's not easy for me to see like the structural things that you see in like production and like, and I know like part of you's like, yeah, I don't know if I want to do that though. But I think that sometimes, and this is where we've talked about, astrology has been so helpful and a gift in my life. And for so many clients is I think there's something in the magic that happens when we become in radical acceptance of our nature.
Yeah.
Like, even like with what we're talking about with social media, like there's a way that like I just did not resonate with, like, here's how I'm going to share as a therapist. Like, even the way that I might sit in sessions is very different than like the creative way I curate posts. But that's what feels true for me and what feels like me. And I think it's like, if you don't enjoy it, that's because you're not supposed to, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I just haven't figured out what that is yet, you know? Because it is like, we all know it's still important. It's important to, you know, it's marketing. I mean,
yeah, it's not.
But yeah, I think I was telling you earlier, like, speaking of astrology, I had a reading with a new astrologer recently, and she made this comment to me, which I thought was really interesting, where she said, you spent so much of your life trying to prove that you're different or try to do things differently. And she said, like, how that's a good quality, but also like in doing that, you essentially like, you don't like lean into things that you actually really love, or you might not actually, you know, like, it's almost like it reminds me a little bit of like that, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face saying, you know. I thought that was so interesting because I feel like I actually have a lot of clients who as well, like this idea of, I'm bringing it back. I swear there's a circle here, but the bring back that I'm trying to make is like, we started talking about this idea of shoulds and how a lot of us have spent our lifetime or centuries, really our species, doing things that we have been told we should do, or in the ways that we should do them. And this is the path and this is how you do it. And I feel like part of it also is like, it's the questioning of it. It's like, but why? Like, why am I doing it? And even in the rebelling in and of itself sometimes too, actually is still, what she was saying to me is another form of shoulds, actually. It can be, you know, because then again, you're just doing it for the sake of doing it differently. And it's also just a should. It's still not going based on feeling, I think, is where the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's, I think that you were a very, I'm like,
what am I today?
Well, I watch
Analyze
you
me.
sometimes. You're like, is this you were breaking me down? But I think like I watch you put a lot of pressure on yourself sometimes to be like very conscious and like aware of like, like when we travel, like how you are showing up as a white woman in the world that is conscious of like other people's oppression and maybe your privilege. And I think that sometimes like it's just like things like that I watch you attempt to not be what the world might experience you as. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes I see it as like pressure that you put on yourself, and I'm like, babe, you could just live. Like I feel like in your 40 years you probably proved yourself to be good and woke, and maybe you could just live. I know it's easy for me to
what
say,
are you talking about?
Vanessa tries to be woke. I'm just kidding. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's also like, this just popped into my mind. I was talking, my neighbor, who's a good friend of mine, we were having this conversation about, I'm trying to think of what the instigator was, but we were saying something about, I think this girl we were talking about is like maybe from LA, born and raised in LA. And then her and I, so my friend I'm talking about, she's from Ohio originally, and I'm from upstate New York. And we were just talking about like this concept. Oh, I remember what it was. This idea of like, when I left my hometown, there was never a moment where going home was like even on the table. Wasn't an option. It wasn't something I thought about. Like I would have actually slept on people's couches or I would have gone into a hostel before I would have gone home. Right. And it wasn't necessarily like, oh, my home was the worst place to be. It just was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going back. I'm not, going back. Exactly. That's what it was. I'm not going back. And she felt the same way. And she's like, but it's so funny, right? Like I think there's certain kinds of people, there's certain kind of personality structures maybe where like you just since the jump have been trying to like prove something.
Yes.
And I guess maybe you like hit a certain age where you're like, I'm so tired. And I think collectively that's what we're all doing too. It's like, we're all so fucking tired. Like we're so sick of like jumping through hoops and trying to prove shit,
Oof. Felt that, I think there's something we've talked about just in terms of the way our societal structure is. It's just like we need to hustle to prove our worthiness for a lifetime. You need to like make something of yourself, reach a certain status, accumulate a certain sense of power somehow, something.
Yeah.
And I feel like the most magic has come into my life the moment I stopped feeling like I had something to prove. And I think I spent so many of my years, like, whether it's like the model minority thing or like just feeling like, the path that I was following was different than what was expected from me for my family. So I needed to prove that I was going to be like somehow like successful in whatever I was doing, whatever that looks like. And the minute that I was like, if I never have any success and I can't care anymore, then all of a sudden the universe was like, okay, you're finally ready to not be like, because I think there's something that is like, well, I guess that's like our ego striving to feel like it is enough. And of course, like that doesn't ever completely go away. But I do think there's like a quicker remembrance of like, none of this matters. It really doesn't, except one, like what feels like aliveness within this one wild and precious life that I have, but also how am I meant to serve with my particular brand of magic, with who I am. And I just believe that each of us has what is particular to us. And so often we're looking outside of ourselves to identify what that is. And if other people affirm it, and if other people like it, then it makes me worthy and then it means it's real. But it's like, no, that's like such the inside job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's it. I think that's what people are finally at least starting to come to terms with, is like, I mean, I don't know. There's still a lot of like groupthink going on, but I think I guess I'm hopeful because I think I'm seeing more individual and collective just questioning, like, what is my gut saying? What is my, what is my body telling me? I don't know. And I guess, yeah, maybe this is me talking as somebody who's about to turn 40 because I feel like I've always been pretty intuitive and I've always been pretty tapped into my body. I just think I've been really good at overriding it. Because I feel like I've known for a lot longer than I've like given myself credit for knowing, like the knowing, right? Air quotes. And maybe that's what it is too, right? I mean, we all come into this body knowing. We all have the ability to know like what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what our body wants, what our soul wants, what, but it just gets muddied. It gets buried underneath all the bullshit.
And it's the fitting in.
Yeah.
Because I think, as I was listening to you, what was coming up is that like, I do think that that's true. And there's such a like belief in self and wisdom that like you've always carried. And I'm always like, God, you've always been like an older soul. And there's a lot of like sacrifice of self that was a survival mechanism that you've also carried. And I think those things come up at odds with one another for so many of us. And this is where relationships get tricky. Circling back to what you were saying before about the codependency, I think so much it's that attachment versus authenticity. And that like, we are in the space of like trusting my knowing more. And sometimes that is meaning that attachments are just going to change, that our relationship structures and where we found safety, quote, in relationships, we weren't actually finding safety. We were finding fitting in, but it wasn't authentic belonging because it was a lot of times the sacrificing of the authentic self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
it's been a while since we brought you guys one of our meandering conversations where we just like riff. It's like what we used to do all the time.
I know, which feels weird now because I feel like we've done so many like Q&As and things that us just like recording while we're just talking for an hour feels kind of different.
And yeah, if you go back.
Maybe vulnerable.
I know, seriously. And this is, if you go back, I mean, this is really what the whole podcast was. This was like the whole first season, basically.
It always started.
Mm-hmm. But you just got a little peek into us laying on my hotel bed after a day out in the city. Danae's got lots of fun book things this week. That's why we're here. And May 28th. Her book is being birthed into the world. So if you haven't pre-ordered it yet, make sure you do. Sovereign Love. It's a big deal.
Like, it's such a surreal thing. I held it in my hands for the first time today and just like wept. It's unbelievable. That's like birthing something so unbelievably vulnerable and so close to my soul. But I feel really grateful.
It is a birth, man. Oof, it's a birth. That is the truth. All right, you guys. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Cheaper Than Therapy.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to share it with a friend, subscribe, and give us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
And if you want to connect with us more, find us on Instagram at Cheaper Than Therapy, the podcast.